The meeting will begin, and I see already our panelists online. Welcome to you. It will start in 1-2 minutes, I think. Our panelists in person are also here. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, no? Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure for me to open today this very timely event, Spotlight on Circularity. It is organized as part of the Geneva Dialogues on Minerals and Metal Resources that has been launched 2 months ago. And it will last all year, all this Geneva dialogue on minerals and metal resources. And it is really great to be here in the context of the UNECE Resource Management Week. Over the next 30 years, we may need to produce more metals and minerals than in the entirety of human history. These resources are essential for the energy transition, but not only, as you know, for infrastructure, for digitalization and economic development. However, their extraction and processing can have several very important environmental impact. A recent study published in the journal Nature warns that the threats to biodiversity from mining will significantly increase as more material are extracted for renewable energy. And something that I like to share with you, what I heard, we have 3 crises. We speak about the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, and pollution crisis. And now we try to solve the climate crisis, but we should not create a new crisis, the material crisis. So circular approach are very important, and actually they could also be an opportunity for resource-rich countries. Investing in recycling infrastructure, material recovery, and local value chain support economic diversification, while reducing dependence on volatile commodity markets, foster innovation and skill development. So recycling industry create more jobs per ton of materials than primary extraction. And we also have to have it in mind. Today it was very interesting panel we had and the whole week, and we focus more on extraction, the problem on the site or tailing, something like that. But we should also consider the circularity and the benefits of the circularity. Myself, I am Martin Roll. I am Deputy Head of International Affairs Division in the Ministry of Environment in Switzerland, Swiss Federal Office for the Environment. And Switzerland, as you know, is not a mining country, but we are deeply connected to these global issues. We are consumers of materials, producers, and we consume also products that drive environmental impact abroad. And many companies headquarters in Switzerland are key actors in the global trade of minerals and metals. So it is the reason why Switzerland, together with other countries, has initiated 3 resolutions at the UNEA, at the United Environmental Assembly. And a resolution launched a global intergovernmental process with more than 100 countries participating. And together we develop proposals that promote the environmental sustainability of minerals and metal throughout the whole life cycle. And I was nominated by UNEA to co-chair during 1 year this intergovernmental process with Pakistan together. And it was very interesting to listen which kind of needs the countries have. And we heard also today the panel of the Secretary General of the UN, who also make recommendations. This panel on yes, critical energy transition, and one of the recommendation is typically on circularity efficiency. So we will hear more about that. So together, let's now work to make circularity a concrete reality. All stakeholders, governments, international organizations, industry, civil society, the scientific community, we all share together the common responsibility to strengthen environmental protection. So I wish a very fruitful discussion during this GEN event. And now I have the pleasure to invite our speakers to take the floor. And I have my co-chair for this event. And please, you can, Mr. Ligeti, we heard you can present yourself. The beginning makes the other part.
Thank you, and good afternoon, colleagues, for those here in the audience, and good afternoon as well for those who join us online today to this, I believe, the third Geneva dialogue on minerals and metals that took place. We're very honored as UNECE to be one of the organizing entities around these Geneva dialogues, and it all came out from having all the organizations based in Geneva, not just international organizations, but you know, national organizations, non-governmental organizations, which are active in the mineral space in Geneva, go together and exchange and talk to each other and exchange our perspectives and bring forward the dialogue, the discussions around such an important and critical topic as the minerals and metals resources for the energy transition. And we're very happy to host them here at the Palais in the framework of the Resource Management Week 2025. Very important appointment in the global discussion around minerals, which takes place every year here at the Palais, and where we discuss about all the different aspects around the issue around minerals, not just for the energy transition, but overall resource management, sustainable resource management. And there's a lot of focus on minerals, but we don't have to forget that there are resources out there, and it's all about how we can use them in a sustainable fashion going forward. I am Dario Liguti, and I lead the energy division here at the UNECE, at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, and it's my pleasure as well to be leading with the team here this week's discussions, which are taking place alongside meetings in other places around the Palais on issues such as gas and coal mine and just transition, which is a very important aspect, not only for the energy space, but as well for minerals. And it's my pleasure as well to open up, do the kind of opening speech, let's say, to give the background for then the panelists to go into more details around them. So let me just to give the framework. This is nothing new to all of you. What are the critical minerals challenge? You know, the growing demand. The chair opening the today have already given some numbers and the scope of what we need to support the energy transition. And I recall, as I said earlier on today, one of the issues around why we're not going as fast as possible is as well the availability of these minerals that are fundamental for the manufacture of the equipment that goes into the new energy technologies. And therefore, obviously, the issue around minerals availability in quantity and quality sufficient to fuel the energy transition is one of the challenges around that. The second one, of course, you would say, okay, but you're talking about primary resources. How about secondary resources? What is the circularity? And we need to establish a circular model now. Because it costs a lot less to create a circular model from the start than imposing a circular model once you started with the old model. And we know, and we have here experts who will talk more about that, and the efforts that we're putting in inserting circularity into today's energy model, which I recall everybody is still pretty much a linear model where you extract, burn, use, and then dispose of energy resources, and is very much so as well when it comes to minerals. For a large part of the minerals life cycle is still a linear model. Obviously, what are the challenge is the urgency. The energy transition cannot wait because climate change doesn't wait. Doesn't respect time, and is actually accelerating, as you have seen from the scientists from UNECE and the IPCC, that the climate change is actually accelerating its pace, and therefore it is urgent to enact what we collectively have taken as commitments when it comes to climate change. And so what I want to recall the role that we have been discussing around here. The UN got all together, all the UN different agencies involved in this space got together, and we've been working for many years on these issues individually, but 2 or 3 years ago, we all got together to create a UN system push because, as the Secretary General then said, it is a political, it's not only an economic and an environmental challenge and issue, it's a political issue. And therefore, we got all together, and the reason as well today, we are all together showing here, this is a jointly organized with UNEP event to highlight how we came as a UN system and providing the tools and what is necessary for that to happen. So technologies are out there, capitals are out there, methodologies and tools are out there. What is missing is putting these pieces together. The toolbox is available. It's using that toolbox and using it in a coherent way and with clear objectives. And that is what is missing today. And that would be as well one of the focus that will be of the panelists today that will be discussing around that. So so what is how do we approach that? And you can see here a very schematic implementation pathways. And I said is the toolbox is there, which is and how do you actually activate that toolbox? How do you actually use? It starts with the governance infrastructure. It goes into government actions. When it happens in real life, you need industry initiatives. And then you have to measure, because somebody said, if you cannot measure, it doesn't exist. And so certainly you need success metrics. All alongside this path, which goes, if it's very much a top-down approach, but it's not only a top-down approach. It needs to be met with bottom-up initiatives, with bottom-up approval and engagement from the different stakeholders. We put there some of the concrete tools or concrete examples of how a governance infrastructure can be implemented, how government actions are actually happening. The EU Critical Raw Material Act of 2024 is a clear government action, or a supranational government action, but impacts 27 EU members and countries outside of the EU that trade with the EU. How industry initiatives are looking at this. Resources as a service is an example of how to address the issue of rarity and sustainability around minerals, and what some of the success metrics are, which are very important. And with that, Chair, I want to reassure you, I finished my opening remarks, because we are here to listen to the panelists, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dario, for this insight. And it is very interesting to see what UNECE is doing, and not only for the region UNECE, but at the global level. And it is very, very interesting, the development also of the framework classification for resources and the impacts that you will continue to have in this discussion. Very interesting. Now, I am very pleased to give the floor to three leading experts, actually, will now present recently published and forthcoming report by the International Resource Panel as well as by UNEP. And first, I would like to give the floor to Janes Potočnik, who is a co-chair of the International Resource Panel. You can present yourself a little bit. Also, Janes, it's a great pleasure to have you here. And you will present the Global Resource Outlook, which was published last year by the International Resource Panel, with really the focus on circularity and minerals. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you, Martin. It's a great pleasure, and I will not spend the time of presenting myself, but I will rather focus on the substance. So I will start sharing my screen, and if you would just confirm that everything is in order, now it should be fine. Yeah? Do you see the screen, please? Can you just confirm?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, super. So first of all, I will talk about, put everything what you are discussing today a bit in the context of what came as a result of our Global Resource Outlook, International Resource Panel, then lead you to the role of circular economy in that context, and finally end with critical raw materials so that everything is where it should be. So if I start with a Global Resource Outlook. So we should never underestimate the importance of natural resources. Just think it, that access to and use of natural resources in human history have been always closely related to the level of the well-being achieved by nations. Unfortunately, also to stability, security, conflicts, and wars. So just think about access to land, water, oil and minerals, precious metals. And in a way, it was also driving the geopolitical efforts of consumption countries to politically control the resource-rich countries. And the whole history of, if we call it the colonialization of nature, is of course central also to fairness and equity. When we talk about materials, we talk about biomass, fossil fuels, metals, and non-metallic minerals. So everything extracted from the earth. If we add the land and water, we talk about resources, or if you wish, natural resources. One of the conclusions of our report is that the economy championed by industrialized nations is wasteful and unjust, and that we must shift away from the prevailing resource wasteful economic approach because it's simply ethically and ecologically unsustainable. So we must set the order right. Economy was invented to serve humans and not the opposite. If we just quickly look to the trends, in the last 50 years, global material use, so everything extracted from Earth, has more than tripled. All components were increasing, but if we look into the structure, then the fastest growing part was actually non-metallic minerals, which is easy to explain. This is basically the growth of cities, infrastructure, in the regions where most of the world population lives. So if we then go to some of the elements which are quite decisive in our analysis, we do look to the questions a lot through the material footprint approach. Why? Because it's not looking from the point of view which countries are rich by resources, but rather which countries are using their materials in their consumption. So material footprint is domestic extraction plus raw material trade balance, so imports minus exports. So if we look to this material footprint in the last 20 years or so, we can find out that, for example, in Europe and North America, it was actually not increasing. It was new population growth and economic growth was neutralized by technology. While in Africa and West Asia, it was increasing a lot, but mainly due to population growth. In Asia Pacific, South Europe, it was again increasing a lot, but due to the economic growth. And on the world level, we end with a figure, 62% growth. 2/3 could be explained by economic growth and 1/3 by population growth. And the impact of technology is rather minor. But of course, the story of Europe and North America would be excellent if we would not be on much too high levels per capita. As you can see, in particular in the United States, this is, or better to say North America, this is relatively problematic. Then we asked ourselves the question, which are those human needs which are most material intensive? Built environment, mobility, food, and energy are actually more than 90% of global material demand. But if we look it through the country perspective, country income groups, then we see that in low-income countries, more than half, it's for food provision. In lower middle-income countries, for food provision and for built environment, for housing. In upper middle-income countries, for mobility and built environment, and while in high-income countries, it's structured some 20% for almost resource-intensive, which is clearly giving you an impression what is most important and what people on various kind of levels of development need first. When we have looked then to the impacts, then we have find out that high-income countries use 6 times more materials per capita than low-income countries and are responsible for 10 times climate impacts. The quickest growing, it's of course middle-income countries, and the tragical story is of course low-income countries, which remain comparatively very low and mostly unchanged. We also analyzed through the impacts optic, extraction and processing of materials. It's actually driving the triple planetary crisis mentioned by Martin. 60% of global climate change impacts could be explained, 40% of air pollution impacts, and practically all water stress and land-related biodiversity loss. For the first time, we have analyzed those impacts also through human needs provisioning systems. And we can see that climate impacts are basically very much distributed between all human needs, while pollution is more related to household fuel use, and that water stress biodiversity loss, it's more related to the food production. There are a few policy recommendations which we have listed. Institutionalized resource governance, define resource use path. So to be clear, setting resource like science-based resource targets, in particular in high-income countries. Direct finance towards sustainable resource use, making trade an engine of sustainable resource use, mainstream sustainable consumption options, and create circular resource efficient and low impact solutions and business models. So as co-chairs, we have started an initiative of call to action where we have basically defined 4 missions: better orientation, better measurement, better economic incentives, and better transparency and governance, where we are asking or pleading that maybe we would need something on international level, which would be organized in the same way as we have it currently organized in energy. So something like international material energy, where the doors on which you knock if you would want to get all the data connected to materials. So to summarize, our main message is that the growth of well-being should be decoupled from the growth of economic activity, both from the growth of resource use and altogether from environmental impacts, that we should look to all natural resources and focus on those which are most resource intensive, which leads me to the circular economy. So circular economy is actually instrument helping delivering exactly that decoupling I was talking about. It's also part of the bigger logic picture of economic, societal, cultural transformation needed to deliver SDGs. It's using common sense because all nature is actually based on the principles of circularity. So it's the oldest concept on the planet Earth. So the real question which is behind is just this one. Are we humans part of nature? And if we are part of nature, why we are not behaving accordingly? So one of the important parts of the perception in the circularity logic is this one. If you would ever complain that you are caught in a traffic jam, you are simply wrong. You are a traffic jam. So we need to look at it from a personal perspective. So we actually don't need cars, we need mobility, we don't need light bulbs, we need light, we don't need chairs, we need to sit, we don't need refrigerators, we need chilled, healthy food, we don't need CDs, we want to listen to the music, we don't need pesticides, we want healthy plants. So dematerialization, rethinking ownership, efficiency complemented with sufficiency, and asking a very simple question. How can we meet the same human needs, if you want, in the most energy and resource efficient way? And whenever we talk about sufficiency, you can approach to the sufficiency from a consumption side, which is no-brainer, but also from a production side. How can we meet the same needs by using less energy and materials, by improving energy and resource efficiency? Which leads me to the climate change. Why is circular economy so important part of the solution? So climate change, if we just look to the facts, global CO2 emissions are still increasing. Global surface temperature increase, according to Copernicus, on a monthly level last year was between 1.5 and 1.7 degrees. So we have already crossed the level which we have set as a target we should not cross. The system that moves water around the earth is off the balance for the first time in human history, which was last year very clearly shown by the Global Commission on the economics of water. And unfortunately, when we look to the fossil fuel subsidies, according to IMF, we still can see that they are taking a huge percentage of GDP on a global level. So it's a kind of global hypocrisy indicator, if you wish. Climate breakdown, climate change, of course, energy transition is terribly important. Of course, technological development is terribly important. But we should understand that climate breakdown is a symptom of ecological overshoot. And that material footprint is, in a way, dangerously under-discussed. And that we should focus also on the overshoot, which highlights the material usage. Waste output, which clearly is showing also the wastefulness of economic system, and growth of human society, which was more than doubling in the last 50 years. Like it was nicely said, of course we should look how we basically transition the energy system, but at the same time, we should also ask for what that energy will be used and take into account our production and consumption patterns, which are of course not sustainable. Hart Hogan, environmental journalist, nicely summarized that by saying, species causing the extinction of 150 species per day does not need more energy to do more what it does. So climate change can be effectively addressed by combining supply-side solutions, carbon management, energy transition, with decoupling circular economy, demand-side solutions, and with nature-based solutions. And predominantly the focus in the COPs is still on the orange part. And there is a lot of potential in everything what you are trying to address. It was already mentioned that UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres actually has established a critical energy transition for mineral panels. And it's also clear that his statement here, it's very clear. But one thing which is important to remember, this panel was set to enable energy transition needed to help tackle environmental climate change challenge. So it basically has environmental roots. IRP work, it's very much connected to few work streams. One is the global resource outlook, which I have mentioned. Then we have also published already a new governance framework, sustainable development license to operate. I will a bit closely present the 3 solution pillars for effective transition material management, which was a co-chair's piece, and Paul later on will be definitely talking about incoming report financing the responsible supply of energy transition minerals for sustainable development. So, in short, current policy measures are pretty much concentrating on supplying transition materials with highest environmental and social standards. So securing enough supply in sustainable way and geographic diversification of that. They are normally adding also the circularity level, but predominantly focusing on recycling. So capturing future secondary transition materials. So what was actually our message? Our message was this one. Recycling potential in circularity is solution where you have stable needs. When you have growing needs, like you have it now in the critical raw materials, it's not a solution. So if you will need in 10 years, 10 times more batteries, if you recycle all the batteries of today, this will not actually meet the needs. So what would be really important is that to those circular levers you add, also thinking about more intensive use, lightweightening, lifetime extension, and in the first place, optimizing the delivery of human needs in energy and material intensive systems, which are in particular in mobility and housing. So if you want, the problem is that we are not really asking the question of the baseline, in particularly in high income and high demand countries. The baseline is too high and we need to move it down. And if we move it down, then also the future needs would be easier to meet, and also the future energy demands will be more reasonable. So our modeling is showing that this is possible. We can mitigate material use by 30% by 2060. And also global energy demand could be reduced according to our modeling for 25%. If you look at it from the point of view of low income, high supply countries, then transition should be just and equitable and providing energy needs for all. And they should benefit from value addition, job creation, and long-term resilience, sustainable mining practices, fair market structures, responsible consumption in high-demand countries are thus essential to ensure that energy transition does not come at the expense of those who provide its fundamental resources, but rather benefit them. This leads me to conclusions. Since you are Commission linked to the European Union, I would just say that global supply chains, as you know, are becoming increasingly volatile. And for years it is known that Europe and our economy is very import dependent and fragile when it comes to energy and to majority of the materials. But the times were good, and when the times are good, not many really care about that fact. So competitiveness and strategic autonomy can only be based on a responsible resource use and management, including fossil fuels. And in short, circular economy, it's actually also a European quest for competitiveness. So when it comes to the signals from the markets, don't waste time chasing butterflies, mend your garden, and the butterflies will come, like Mario Quintana, the Brazilian author, said. Industry needs clear strategic direction, predictability, support for a grid travel of direction, good level playing fields as it gets, all based on a clear vision designed by policymakers. We are unfortunately indebting future generations financially and by depleting the nature, which is simply wrong. Apparently, we humans are the most intelligent species on the planet. It's high time to prove it. More than an economic or a technological choice, this is actually a moral choice. Sustainability, it's a major business opportunity. Why? Because it's unavoidable and because all who are innovative, all who dare and understand the essence of the challenge will be ahead of the curve. Some are saying that business leaders don't understand that. But if you look to the World Economic Forum Global Risk Assessment, which they are producing each year, in 10 years perspective, the business leaders see the major global risks in extreme weather events, biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, critical change to our systems, and natural resource shortages. Why they are not entirely following that path? Because the economic system as it is driven would actually result for them that they would lose sooner or later their jobs. So changing our relationship with the rest of nature, it's not only environmental, it's economic, equity, security imperative to strengthen our resilience. Relationship among humans and the rest of nature, it's simply not stable and balanced, and it could be resolved only in two ways: with collective wisdom and effort, or in a hard or quite painful way. The future will be green and fairer and more equal, or there will be simply no sustainable future which we would like to live in. And this is the last slide. It's actually a very interesting advice from the most famous Belgium. I'm most of the time spending still in Belgium. That's the detective Hercule Poirot. When he was once asked why he's speaking about himself always in a third person, he replied something like that: if one is such a genius like me, it's very important to establish a healthy distance to himself. So that's actually our collective challenge. And establishing that healthy distance is understanding that we are not the first, nor the last, and not the only one. It's the essential way of our challenge, which we have to deal with. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Janes. It was very inspiring. Also, what Hercule Poirot said at the end. You have always, in the presentation of the IRP panels as a co-chair, always with good insight and also humor when you present these very challenging issues. And what I always take over from you is we have to change our perspective. We have to think in system. There are solutions. We should not waste time. So thank you very much. And I just remember the International Resource Panel is a little bit like the IPCC for climate change, but for resources. And based on the International Resource Panel report, we could have these three resolutions at UNEA. It was actually the scientific basis we had in 2019 to continue the discussion at the global level. Thank you so much. Now I would like to give the floor to Mona Mohamed. You will present, you are working for the Life Cycle Initiative by UNEP, and you will present the report, which name is Critical Transition, Circularity, Equity and Responsibility in the Quest for Energy Transition and Minerals. And you have the floor, please, Mona.
Thank you, Martine. Thanks for the introduction as well. And thanks for the time to speak with all of you today. Thank you. So today's presentation, I'm going to look at the context where we developed this working paper. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the 8 R's and how we are looking at achieving circularity and what that would look like and what it means for minerals. Then I will quickly go over the benefits of circularity, particularly vis-a-vis the demand curve that Janes was talking about. And then the last thing is, this is an effort that everybody needs to partake in. And so there will be a few recommendations for the different stakeholders on the implementation at the end. So on the next slide, please. So as you have heard already, we are looking at about a 6-fold increase in the production of minerals from the 2022 levels. And the context of the work for us is we've been working a lot with the Secretary General panel and on critical energy transition minerals, and the panel came out with 5 actionable recommendations, which covered topics such as benefit sharing, transparency and accountability, legacy mines, artisanal and small-scale mining. And then the 5th recommendation focused on equitable targets and timelines for the implementation of material efficiency and circularity approaches across the entire life cycle of critical energy transition minerals. So with that in mind, we put together this working paper to look at what literature already exists out there and what may be some of the recommendations we can look at. We identify a list of 26 minerals, which you can find in the annex of this report that will be essential to the clean energy technologies. And these include minerals needed for batteries, but also minerals needed for some of the extension and network connections work. And of course, the production of electricity. And so as we are looking, the IEA had put together a report where they estimated that by 2050, we're looking at a 6-fold increase in the mineral requirements for these technologies. But the question is, how quickly can this demand curve for these minerals will be projected to rise? And that will really depend on a lot of different factors, but in particular, technological developments, behavioral change, and government policies and industrial action. So the good news here is that unlike fossil fuels, we are looking at minerals that are infinitely recyclable, which means the likelihood and our ability to keep them in the system for longer it's possible to do that, and so we're able to do that. And so using better efficiency and principles like circularity, we can definitely reduce the cumulative need for new energy transition demands. So this is, of course, caveated by what Janusz was just saying about where does the demand start and for different countries. So on the next slide, thank you. On the next slide, you'll see that we've developed an 8 R's framework for the equitable green transition. And really here what we're looking at is, in order to reduce the need for new mining, systemic changes will have to be made to promote greater circularity. First, we're going to need standards and regulations to drive the investment and create markets that are more efficient and circular. Innovation and processes products. We're also going to look for public incentives for greater efficiency and circularity. And then we're going to need accountability and transparency. And I'll speak more about this as well in the next slide. But as we think about these 8 R's, we really need to start by rethinking our systems. Just like Janusz was speaking in terms of mobility, housing, and industry, how do we meet the needs but in new ways and necessarily with fewer minerals? We also need to reduce the meteoric demand for energy transition minerals through improvements to material and energy efficiency. And we're going to need to replace energy transition minerals for lower impact substitutes where possible, reuse products in second and third lives while finding ways to retain the minerals in use for longer, recovering minerals more effectively from production processes and legacy tailing sites, and recycling them into new products. And then it's also vital that these minerals that do need to be extracted are extracted in a responsible way, adhering to the environmental, social, and governance standards that we've been talking about. And across these 8 R's, we should also continue to think about equity, both in access to the energy transition minerals, but also in sharing the benefits generated by the energy transition as a guiding principle as we move forward. So on the next slide, you'll see a figure from research that's been done by Sintaf that looked at 7 different minerals: lithium, manganese, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements, platinum, and copper. And you'll see what the expected demand is, the cumulative mineral demand between 2022 and 2050 looks at about 690 million tons. But there are different things we can do to reduce that demand. And the first thing is looking at the technological choices that we can make. And this, includes both rethinking of the system, but also improvements such as material efficiency and the use of less materials overall. And that could result in about 30% of reduction in demand in these minerals. The next thing is on the use of a circular economy, and by keeping these minerals in circulation longer, we're looking at reducing the demand by a further 18%. And then finally, by improving recycling at the end of a life cycle, then we're looking at about 10% drop in the projected demand. And the important takeaway message from this figure is that we don't have one solution for this, and there are multiple things that we will need to be doing and we will need to be thinking to bridge the supply gap and reduce the risk of short-term supply shortages of key critical energy transition minerals. So on the next slide, which is my last slide, we'll be talking about the roles that everyone has to play in delivering the sustainable energy transition. And it's important to note that we're going to need to achieve several features simultaneously and at almost unprecedented scale. For the energy transition, we're going to need coherent policies supported by effective regulatory frameworks, effective incentives, and standards that are applied throughout the value chain, supported improved governance and collaboration at both national and international levels. So when we look at standards, we're going to need to harmonize and improve existing ones, but we're also going to need new standards and targets for responsible mining. And then we're going to make sure that we're implementing them both throughout governments and industry. When we look at transparency, we're going to need to see some innovation in terms of labeling and information on the durability, recyclability, and repairability of mineral products. And we're also going to need to strengthen the collection and sharing of data on the mineral value chain. On the technology side of the house, we're going to need to invest more in research and development of circular solutions to create more efficient technology and to promote technology transfer between countries. And financial institutions also have an important role to play here, and considerations such as creating mineral wealth funds, implementing dynamic royalty systems, as well as reconsidering the finance infrastructures and enabling it for recycling industries, and reinvesting mineral profits in local developments will be key elements to consider. And then finally, on the policy side, we're going to both need to develop the legislative guidelines and support its national implementation. And then at the same time, we would need to create circularity and efficiency roadmaps and targets for the mining industry. So I hope that this has piqued your interest, and you can always find the document on our website. On the next slide, please, where you can read in more details about this topic. Thank you very much. Good to see you all today.
Thank you very much, Mona. It's very interesting what UNEP does in this regard. It was also to give some insight also for the panel. You write this before the panel work of the Secretary General. But when I see your presentation, we are speaking about circularity, but at the end, it's always coming back at the producer, at the extraction. It's interesting. But what you put on, and also in the preparation of the today meetings, is 8 R's. And actually, responsible extraction is coming at the end before we have to think others. It's also regarding communication, but also behavior, actually. Thank you so much, Mona. Now, I'm very pleased to have Paul Eakins. We know also you very well from the International Resource Panel, but for all your work you are doing in economics, also as a professor for a very long time, also at the Resource and Environmental Policy Institute for Sustainable Resources in the University College of London. And you are working for the International Resource Panel now on a very specific report on finance, the supply of energy transition. And please, you have the floor, Paul.
Well, thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. And I need to know whether, first of all, I need to share my screen, or whether the presentation will be done for me by the Secretariat. Yes, that's very kind. Thank you very much. So a little bit of introduction to myself, in addition to what Martine said. I'm working intensively on circular economy issues at the moment. I'm Deputy Chair of the UK Government's Task Force on the Circular Economy, which will be producing our strategy for circular economy towards the end of this year, and specifically on financing that circularity. I had a meeting this morning with representatives of the Dutch government and the City of London finance sector in order to discuss precisely the topic of financing circularity. And I'll say a little bit more about that as I go through. Next slide, please. So this is the report that I've been working on for the last few years with colleagues on the IRP. You can see that chapter 4, right at the bottom there on the left-hand side, is particularly about recycling and circular economy. And I'm going to be focusing mainly on that part of the report. But when we get into part 2, you can see that we're looking much more broadly at the financing of the production of these minerals and metals. And we can be sure that quite a lot of that production will not come from virgin ores, but will come from the great mounds of tailings, which are many billions of tons of tailings that have been produced from mining in the past, and of course from circular economy activities. Next slide, please. So, as people have said, there is going to need to be a very considerable increase in minerals for the energy transition technologies, the low carbon technologies. You can see here, this is the IEA estimate from last year from various scenarios. So there's the sustainable development scenario, there's the announced pledges scenario, and there's the net zero emissions scenario. And we're going up there to tens of millions of tons of these new minerals. Now, although that sounds a lot, it's much less than we currently mine, for example, coal. So if the transition is successful away from fossil fuels, the total amount of mining will actually decrease dramatically. When you think that both India and China are currently using more than 1 billion tons of these fossil fuels, of coal particularly, you can see that substituting that for just millions or tens of millions of tons of these new minerals will actually result in a very significant reduction in mining. But of course, this mining will have to change. This mining will have to become more responsible. And a large part of our report is talking about what that means, to what extent it can be achieved, and how the mining companies will have to adapt to that. Next slide, please. So for this mining, and indeed for the circular economy, there will need to be a lot of investment. And again, we've got two of the same scenarios here, the announced pledges scenario and the net zero emissions scenario. So we're talking about the sort of investment that we'll need to 2040. And we're talking about 800 billion US dollars. The good news is, and this came up specifically in the meeting this morning with the finance sector, the good news is that there's no shortage of money. If we want to invest in these activities, there's plenty of money to do that. But in order for that money to come from the private sector, and I think everyone envisages that the private sector will have a very large role to play in this, the incentives have to be there. The risk-return ratio has to be right, and governments have an absolutely fundamental duty to adjust current markets, which favor the linear economy, as we've been discussing, so that they start to favor circular economies, and we will find that the investment will then flow into that direction. Next slide, please. So there are lots of investment issues that are stopping the investment flowing into these minerals, whether circularity or whether new minerals. There are lots of different stages in mining investment, and that applies to getting these minerals from tailings or other sources already in the economy, as well as it does to getting virgin resources. Obviously, prices play a huge role in the risk-return ratio, and the pricing of these minerals is currently extremely problematic. We have a chapter on that in our report. It's perfectly clear that we don't actually know what causes this extreme volatility of prices, whereby lithium, for example, shot up in price a couple of years ago. Lots of investment went into it, but before much new resource could come on, the prices had all collapsed, and there will be some difficulties, therefore, from those people who'd made all those investments. Another really important argument for circularity is the geopolitical concentration of these minerals, both the mining of them and the processing of them. China is dominant in both those areas, and it therefore seems very important once Europe, which Europe, for example, has very little of these minerals in its territories. Once Europe has bought these minerals from foreign countries, it seems important for Europe to make the best use of them, the most efficient use of them, and not simply allowing them to be thrown away into a site or burnt. The responsibility of mining incurs huge risks. So increasingly, the industry is recognizing that they will need to become more responsible. We've got the new Sustainable Development License to Operate, which was the subject of a previous International Resource Panel report on mineral resource governance. And so I'll just concentrate on that final bullet point, that it makes sense to generate as much new mineral supply as possible from circular economy approaches and secondary minerals. Next slide, please. So you will all know, I'm sure, the waste hierarchy. The important thing to notice about the waste hierarchy is that recycling is towards the bottom of it. And as we've already heard from Mona, further up the waste hierarchy is the whole number of R's, the reuse, repair, refurbish, etc., which currently are very unrepresented in government policy, and which we've so far in Europe and elsewhere not been very successful at. This is the focus of the UK government task force, very much on that level rather than recycling. And it's perfectly clear, and our report goes in quite a lot of detail, that there are lots of obstacles to increasing circularity in financing and otherwise, that the incentives for circularity are nothing like strong enough to shift towards the circular economy. And if we don't get those incentives in place, either through economic instruments or through regulation, then we simply will not move towards a circular economy. The finance sector will not invest in it, and businesses won't be able to make a profit from those circular activities. Next slide, please. So we go through in quite a lot of detail as to why, when we move down to the recycling part of the waste hierarchy, that it's difficult, and the current levels of recycling, and the International Resource Panel has produced a number of reports in this area. The current levels, very low levels, reflect that these grand challenges are by no means easy to resolve, but we will have to do that if we are going to become more circular. Next slide, please. I'm going to make a remark which may perhaps be a little surprising to people, but UNECE in his presentation, he sort of presaged it in the sense that you can't recycle something until you've built up the societal stock of it. And that if we're looking, for example, at building, at recycling electric vehicle batteries, well, it may well be 40 years before the electric vehicle batteries that are going on the market now are available for recycling, because after the 15 or 20 years being used in an electric vehicle, they may have 10 or 15 years in a utility scale battery storage facility, and then they may go for another 10 years into a private home where they will help the house recharge their own cars. So you can see there that is going to shift the time by which these minerals are going to become available for recycling, by which time we will largely have to have done the energy transition. So recycling is not going to play a role, much of a role in the energy transition, though it will play an enormous role after the transition has taken place in reducing the need for primary level extraction. Next slide, please. I'm not going to spend time on this one because you've already seen this slide from Mona. But the only thing I will emphasize is that looking at those percentages, recycling actually has less of a role to play than technological choices and circular economy. For example, one of the ways in which we can enormously reduce the quantity of these minerals that we need is to stop the trend of using ever larger motor cars. So sports utility vehicles, SUVs, now the largest share of the market in a country like the UK, uses about twice as many of these minerals as a much smaller car. And so we could, by reversing that trend towards ever larger cars, we could cut the quantity of minerals that we need by about half. And of course, that's the sort of technological choices which we could make, but which we're currently not making. Next slide, please. So, conclusion. Primary extraction will provide the great majority of energy transition minerals for the transition, but provided it is a transition and we start to use less fossil fuels, and particularly less coal, the overall amount of mining will decline very greatly. The mining industry is going to have to transform its environmental, social, and governance performance. And that may mean that some of these minerals become more expensive, and we will need to have a market which allows for that, in the same way that low carbon production is sometimes more expensive than production using fossil fuels, and places like the European Union are making adjustments to the market for imports in order to get the level playing field. Circular economy approaches, particularly before we get to recycling, will be hugely important to reduce the demand for primary materials, but their implementation will require strong policy, and recycling will have a major role to play in reducing future primary mineral demands, but it too will need to overcome considerable challenges to be implemented at scale. So thank you. That's the end of my presentation. Just finally, the report we've been working on, which provides a very comprehensive overview of these issues, as well as what responsible mining entails, will be published during the course of this year by UNEP. Thank you very much. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Paul, for your economic views. Actually, you mentioned strong policies, the incentive for the circularity, it is the governments are asked also to put this strong policy in place. You mentioned also something very important is the geopolitical issues. And it is also regarding to conflict, and it will be more and more going in this direction if the geopolitical and also the resources are not available for everyone in a correct manner. I think you are best involved also and concerned on that, Paul, in all the work you have done so far. And you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation the tailings issues, and tailings is also a resources. And I know that UNECE is working very strongly on this issue, have a lot of expertise and so on, also guidelines, and I think we should also reconsider that also in the UNECE and for the global level, how tailings are actually resources. And now I just want to give the floor to Mr. Peter Hopkinson. You are a member of the UK Government Circular Economy Task Force. Is it correct? And so you know Paul best.
I do.
Yeah.
Hi, Paul.
Hello.
Okay, great. I think I've got 6 minutes maximum. So, Chair, give me a big elbow if I get to 5 minutes and I look like I'm not getting to the finish line. I've got about 5 slides. You can count them down. And thanks for the first 3 speakers, because they've really set the scene wonderfully well. We haven't rehearsed it. They've set the global dimension for what I want to talk about, and I've called it the Global National Circular Economy Data Alignment. So I'm going to give you a UK test case or an example of what does the data and the insights that have been presented so far, what does it mean down on the ground when you're trying to develop policy and implement circular economy at scale? And some of the, I'm here today with 3 hats, really. Dario and others have mentioned that I'm a founder member of the International Centre of Excellence on Sustainable Resource Management in the Circular Economy. That's a UN-backed centre that launched last year, and there's meetings on that tomorrow. I am a member of the task force that Paul is deputy chair. I've got a slide on that just to tell you a bit more about what that is as context. And finally, I guess the last 10 years, I've been working on circular economy data, trying to improve the evidence base for many of the claims that are made about the circular economy, many of them unsubstantiated and unfounded when you get into the detail. So I've got colleagues here, Marcus at the back and others who are listening in, who've been great collaborators over the years. So let's see what we've got. If someone's given me a pointer, that's always dangerous. And we're not going to read all this out. This is the remit of the UK Circular Economy Task Force, which launched last November. And there's 3 points on this that I want to draw your attention to. The first is the headline, that the core goal of the Circular Economy Task Force and the circular economy in the UK is to make a key contribution to the UK government's economic growth mission. That's very important. And harnessing investment into new business models and infrastructure. And Paul's already touched upon this. As you would expect in a task force trying to deliver against that agenda, all the things you would expect to see, a vision, targets, stakeholder engagement, etc., leading to sector-level roadmaps that will set out the pathways to circular economy adoption and implementation, and outcomes of the type that I think we've been hearing previously. And the task force is there to advise. There's about 20 of us. We were asked to be part of it to advise government, cross-governmental civil service and ministers on what we thought were the priorities and the ways that the circular economy should be developed and adopted in the UK around a number of key sectors. There'll be no surprises what those are: construction, transport, mobility, food, textiles, plastics and packaging, etc. So that's the context for what I'm doing, and what I've been doing in the background before the task force was trying to develop with others the start of a national circular economy data observatory to bring data and evidence together to support the types of decisions and policy decisions and investment decisions that are needed in the UK. And this is our generic approach. It won't be of any surprise to you. It's a value chain approach. We use this to define the system of interest from the point of extraction and harvesting all the way through. And what others have called the R strategies, those are in green on this graphic. These are really important because these are the sources of value creation and value capture in the circular economy. And it's those that our data and evidence is targeted at. Where are the points of value creation and capture in the circular economy? The reds are arrows are some of the areas that we focus in the first instance. We've been quite UK-centric over the past few years, but we're increasingly engaging globally. And of course, one of the things we're really interested in is what everyone's been talking about. How do we use the stuff that's in the economy in a more effective way to increase its utilization and to bring it back productively back into the economy for second and subsequent life stages. So here's an example. What we approach, there's a 10-step model that we approach in developing the Circular Economy Observatory. I'm only going to give you 3. The first one is, everybody knows you've got to quantify your baseline. And this is just an example, and Paul alluded to it in his presentation, building up a profile of the stocks of materials and products in the economy through time. This is the real-time data on the UK economy of wind turbine installations inside the UK economy, which contain rare earth permanent magnets. That's our target of interest in this case example. And we're trying to understand how much stuff is there, where is it, who owns it, what condition is it in, what might it be worth at the point at which it exits the economy in future years. And from that, we then forecast into the future through to 2050 from public policy commitments about what does that look like in aggregate and total as the basis then for deciding what might we do with that material in the future. And this is just the figure on the right-hand side is our estimate that there'll be about £7.5 billion worth of rare earth oxide materials, neodymium and dysprosium, just in EVs and wind turbines in the UK by 2050 at today's prices. That's a sort of an aggregate figure that we play around with. What we then do is then start to then bring this into an observatory structure. This is an interactive dashboard, just one example, where policymakers and researchers and those interested in data can come to data in a single reference place and see what the implications might be and what the impact might be of different circular economy strategies, whether it's improving and increasing recycling, extending the life of a magnet, extending the life of a wind turbine or electric vehicle, and to give people the first indication of what that might mean in biophysical tonnages, what that might mean in material value terms. And we've done this for a number of products and material flows. So my final slide, Chair, is what have we learned from the past 4 years from that work and increasingly working with the task force? Well, we've completed 6 case studies. Rare earths was one. We're looking at others, and 6 more are planned. We find that the scientific research evidence and the policy focus is dominated by circular, with much less emphasis on economy. So as some people say to us, you get me at circular, but you lose me at economy. At micro, meso, macro level, this needs to change, as Paul referred to earlier. It's essential that we have an agreed, consistent, flexible taxonomic framework for this work. Otherwise, we get completely lost and overwhelmed by multiple variants of studies and data, metrics, indicators. Hence, it's critical, this is a key point for this audience, that the work we do is aligned and harmonized with the emerging global measurement guidance standards, data and dashboard developments. That includes UNRMS, UNFC, SIA, UNEP, UNITAR, IRP. If they're out of sync, you're not going to be able to see the relationship between the national and the global for the benefit of both. And finally, our work, I think what we found is we've made most progress, being able to accelerate the agenda most by focusing on applications at the product and bill of materials scale, whether that's fuel cells, heat pumps, small-scale nuclear, solar. People understand those. They can grasp those, and they mean something to people down on the ground. So focusing on those areas has enabled us to get into conversations that you find sometimes quite difficult when you're talking about data in an abstract way. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this very interesting insight. What you mentioned at the end, you mentioned it's important to have harmonized, aligned data framework standard. But what I want to give, it's good to have harmonized if it is at a quite higher level. We should not harmonize and to have the common at a weekend, you know. We can also harmonize and say, okay, it's a common denominator, and it will be too weak.
You have
please,
harmonization,
yes.
but you also need to be flexible. We'll come back to that maybe in.
No? You can develop, yes, for sure. Yes, in 1 minute.
Yes, you're right.
Because it's an important discussion. We know there is a lot of standard. We know uniformity, and the private sector, the industry, the government also, and said, which one is the best one? Which one should I follow? And now I would like to have your insight in this regard. Thank you.
You could spend your whole career trying to harmonize, okay? And I feel like I've spent quite a large part of my life trying to harmonize and having arguments about different approaches, different standards. So the second graphic I showed you about that value chain, we call that an agnostic flexible framework for modeling and analyzing the circular economy. What you have to do, though, is recognize that there are emerging global approaches for the measurement and quantification of the circular economy, and if you need to be able to relate to those, but down on the ground there will always be differences of opinion, multiple standards, and what you shouldn't do and can't do is let that stop you making progress. So as Ellen MacArthur told me back in 2009 when she first started the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, don't focus on what you can't do, focus on what you can do. Okay, so that's been a watchword for me and others ever since. And Marcus is over there, refers to, let's try and get a 16th century world map together for this area. Our ambition is Google Earth, but we're a long way away from Google Earth data quality. If we can get 16th century, I think we're probably in the 18th century these days. The quality of data that's coming through is improving. But if everybody moves forward with broad agreement, it means that everybody can join in and improve the quality of the data and the visibility of data through their respective efforts. But if it's a free-for-all, you'll make no progress.
Thank you very much for this insight. So keep flexibility, making progress. Yes, thank you very much. Now, there is another forum, the World Resource Forum, taking place every 2 years in Geneva. And I will give the floor to you, Emmanuel, from this World Resource Forum. It is also a place where we saw just before we have discussion. And the World Resource Forum is also a place where we exchange views, and not everybody has the same view, and it is a good place to have exchange. Please, you have the floor, Emmanuel.
Yeah. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to UNECE and UNEP and Gen for organizing this event. What to add? I mean, it really feels like talking on and standing on the shoulders of giants. In this case, I think a lot was said already today on data, on policies, on systemic transformation. So I'll try to be very concise, being aware and considerate of time, and especially not want to take any time away from Colette, on some messages that could be added here. I think the first question I would like to start from is which circularity for minerals and metals? Depending on where you are standing on the value chain, you probably have very different conceptions of what is circularity in minerals and metals. Starting from the extraction side, you have this remining of tailings, for instance. If you're on the downstream part, you're definitely talking about urban mining, recycling of electronic waste, and all of that. However, one component which is often missing is actually a systemic understanding of how circularity can really drive a better use of minerals and metals, while, as Janet said before, trying to deliver needs within planetary boundaries. And in order to do that, I think one component which is often missing in this conversation is policies are important, trade is important, geopolitics are really important, but innovation is really important. And not only technological innovation, not only innovation at the product or service level, but actually innovation at the system design level. So these are a few things that we'll mention about very quickly. I would like to start a little bit with the European context. So there is the European Environment Agency, which receives the request from the European Commission every 2 years to come up with country profiles of European countries, which are supposed to provide an overview of where countries are standing in terms of public and private sector policies for the circular economy. Now, this graph shows a little bit the evolution of how countries have adopted national circular economy roadmaps. 2015 is the first observation year. It's 10 years ago, right? So it's not a life ago, and there were 0 national circular economy roadmaps. Now, 10 years later, this actually refers to data until 2023. There are 24 countries. This includes both European Union countries, but also countries that are part of the IONET network, which have a national circular economy roadmap. So this is probably the first encouraging news, but also an element of awareness of how far we've come in such a short time, and how maybe we were lagging back then just 10 years ago. Now, in terms of which policies are reported, so which public policies in terms of categories are mostly reported by different countries, we see that research and innovation is the first one, followed by education awareness raising, and then financial support programs that are targeting the circular economy. Now, these are very systemic and holistic analysis of circular economy policies, so they do not focus specifically on minerals and metals. However, it must be said that minerals and metals up to now do not really feature prominently on circular economy roadmaps. There might be a focus on specific value chains. Batteries are high prominence nowadays. There are examples of specific recovery improvements. For instance, there is a lot of investments in Austria on metal recycling. There are interesting examples in Croatia on how to recover mineral waste from earthquakes. So mineral waste coming from buildings that were damaged and demolished by earthquakes. And there's, of course, also the experience of France, more on the downstream part of the reparability and longevity index of how electronics and resources within can be better used. As an overall picture, however, one important consideration comes out, which is how the circularity conversation and how the conversation around demand and access to minerals and metals, so what could be a raw materials policy, are actually very much disconnected still today. So there are people that are thinking about how can we recover resources, urban mining, and there are people talking about how can we procure resources that we need for the new clean technologies. But these conversations tend to be quite disconnected from each other. And this, of course, has repercussions for the efficiency and the efficacy with which circular economy can be embedded in minerals and metals value chains. This graph exactly shows that. So this comes from the report in 2022 and gives an overview of how the circular economy enters into other policies at the public sector level. And I just want to focus on one of these bars, which is the one on the extreme right. Raw materials policy is actually the policy area which has the least circular economy elements within. Now this is coming up. We know that yesterday came these strategic projects from the European Commission, and 10 of them out of 47 are on recycling. So there is something moving in this space, but of course, the reality is still this one, that the disconnect between raw materials policy and circularity is still quite large. I also would like to start from our strategies. I will just be very quick on this. So from closing the loop, slowing the loop, and narrowing the loop, a lot was said already before, and I will not repeat myself, but starting from the closing the loop, of course, this is really a question of technical innovation, optimized logistics. There are a lot of challenges around how do we collect, sort, and recycle products which contain minerals and metals. There is a lot of technical innovation that can help in that at all stages, and also how to optimize the logistics for that, which ultimately will lead to the economic viability of such a process, which is not really there in every case yet. Now, if you look at slow in the loop, these are innovations or strategies at the product level, right? So there is 1 minute. Okay, so reuse and repurpose. And they're really important and underexploited, but it's something which is really at the product level. And finally, there is the narrowing the loop, which are admittedly a bit more vague terms in terms of refusing, rethinking, reducing, but that's really where we can rethink how provisioning systems can deliver human needs while decreasing the demand for minerals and metals. I will conclude then on this slide. What we need now, when I was speaking before about innovation, is really how to design circular systems which are able to deliver human needs while staying within planetary boundaries. So what are the provisioning systems that are most use intensive in terms of minerals and metals? How can circularity enable these systems to satisfy human needs while avoiding and or reducing demand for minerals and metals? And what role do circular products and services have within this system, right? These are just components of the overall system. They're not the end goal. So that's something important to take into account. Also, how can circularity enable this across provisioning system? Mobility, energy, building environment, how we can find synergies across these different sectors, and how, again, on the measurement side, can we really measure to what extent circularity allows us to do so. So this leads to three final very short messages, moving from policy silos to the integration. So raw materials with circularity, different systems together, from the product level to the system level. So from provisioning, from how circular is a certain product or service to how circular is a system. And finally, from mono-agent, so a company, a policy actor, innovating to multi-agent, so coalition of multi-stakeholder actors coming together and collaborating to embed circularity in these systems. This is all of it. I will take the time just to give this to Colette. WRF 25 is coming up on the 2nd and 3rd of September in Geneva. We have three sectors. We're going to look exactly at the integration on the three sectors. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. So we are coming from the innovation, what you mentioned, when we are going to you, Colette van der Ven. You are Director, Tulip Consulting, and you will bring the insight in the paradigm shift. Thank you. Please, you have the floor.
Great, thank you very much. I'll try to be very quick, knowing that we're probably a little bit over time already. I think the stage has been set very well with the speakers that have come before. And I'm actually going to zoom in right perhaps where Janus stopped, which is if we do need that paradigm shift in the way we're looking at the circular economy, but also in how we're going from a world where we're focusing on decarbonization towards a world that needs to focus more on dematerialization, how can we actually operationalize that? And what is the role of government? So I'm focusing on specifically a proposal that Tulip Consulting, my social impact enterprise, has developed for the Vlaanders Waste Agency, and which is basically a proposal to create an EU resources law that would exactly focus on reducing consumption. So not the batteries or the packaging or the Waste Management Act or everything related to recycling, as we've heard, which is the bulk today of a lot of the circular economy initiatives, regulations and directives in the EU, but rather really tackling the overall consumption level. So hence, you see again here, the waste hierarchy framework, we're focusing on the very first, most effective element, prevention. Quick note on that, because we're living in a world that's rapidly shifting, very much going from interests or from values perhaps to interests. But at least in the EU, there is a political opportunity to advance this work. Why? Many of you may be familiar with the Clean Industrial Deal, which has come out 2-3 weeks ago and sets out the new priorities away from, or perhaps also building on, but mostly away from the Green Deal. And there, the priorities are about maximizing the EU's limited resources, reducing dependencies, and enhancing resilience. We've heard already the previous speakers talk about geopolitical dependencies. Actually, especially the EU has a keen interest in reducing reliance on imports of various different materials, as it imports 46% of metals, as well as 100% of battery-grade lithium. And a lot of those are concentrated in key trading partners like China, also Chile, and others. So there is a huge political incentive aligned with the times to actually also reduce consumption and to address this issue. there are other reasons for which the case can be built to make a push for a resources law. There's the overconsumption element. Janis Potocnik already mentioned. We're currently now, I believe, at 17 tons per capita that he said, which is almost twice the sustainable level. It's necessary to meet climate objectives. These two go hand in hand. It's necessary to address the regulatory shortcomings, which predominantly focus on the less efficient prongs of the waste hierarchy. And finally, different EU member states are already addressing some of this, with a handful of them, Belgium, Finland, Netherlands, and Austria, already having put in place absolute consumption reduction targets, but none of these are actually binding. So that creates both a problem in terms of lack of harmonization as well as implementation. What we did in the report was to suggest a resources law to mirror the EU climate law. Right, the EU climate law is legally binding, a legally binding law that requires for the EU member states to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to a net zero by 2050. And because it's legally binding, it guides a lot of the work done currently by the Commission. So a similar structure can be used as the basis to start thinking about what a resources law would look like in the EU. And one of the key elements there is a target, a binding national reduction target. And this is connected to one of the suggestions that Janis made in his presentation about the need for high-level, high-income countries to establish these legally binding targets. There's different ways this can be done. There can be sector-specific targets focused on, say, the build industry or transport or other high material-intensive industries, but that's to be worked out. Indicators are key to be linked to those targets. There's different ones: material consumption, resource consumption, etc. There needs to be a scientific body, like the IRP, for instance, but at EU level, to ensure that evidence is being supplied, and then monitoring mechanisms by states as well as implementation plans. Not all EU member states are the same. Some are a lot more circular than others, and similar to climate change and the climate law, that needs to be reflected in the implementation package. So I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. And just to conclude, if you want to read more about this, I'm happy to send you a link to this research. But basically, excessive consumption of material resources is really at the heart of the triple planetary crisis. And it's time that a lot of the resources that are being developed, not only by governments, but also by other different organizations, are going beyond recycling and other lower level, lower efficiency elements to actually tackle the key issue, which is the consumption part. Now, it's politically aligned with the priorities today, so there's a great opportunity, at least for the EU, to tackle this. It's not currently highlighted specifically, resource consumption reduction, as a priority in the Clean Industrial Deal, but there's still scope to link that. And finally, importance of narrative. We're not talking about a world that dictates how much you can eat or how many flights you can take or things like that at the personal level, but it's very much a narrative that can go hand in hand with individual freedom as well as economic growth, as others before me have more effectively underscored. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colette. It's very interesting also the link with the EU, what is going on, and the proposals that could be made. And you mentioned that you are available also for question. Just before giving the floor to Dario for the closing remark, I would like to give the floor to Diana. Actually, Diana is the person working by UNECE for many years, dealing with the Geneva Environment Network, and you will give us just two insights regarding all this dialogue now, and also where we could find all the presentation.
Thank you very much, Martine. On behalf of the co-conveners of this series of dialogues, which includes, of course, our colleagues of UNECE, but also the World Resources Forum and a few others that you can see on the logos here at the bottom of this slide. I would like to thank you all for being here and to announce that we decided to convene this series with the series, because there's a lot of discussions ongoing in International Geneva related to these issues, and we wanted to have a platform where many of these co-conveners could come together. And one of the other events upcoming in this series that is now confirmed is taking place in early May on the as a side event to the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm conventions, which has the Chemicals and Waste Convention administered by UNEP. It's a side event that will look at the role of the conventions in sustainable circular models for minerals and metals. The event is also going to be streamed online. And we will be at the World Resource Forum and in other forums in International Geneva or online discussing various important topics, including on what we are preparing with Switzerland, Senegal, and other member states regarding the United Nations Environmental Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. And now I would like to give you the floor, Dario, for the closing remark.
Thank you, Chair. I won't attempt in 1 minute to summarize the breadth and wealth of these discussions. However, I would like to give a message to the audience so that it sticks in their minds. And I quite like the R's, the number. We started low, and then we went to 8, and then we ended up with 10. And I want to propose 2 more R's. The first one is remember the previous 10. And then there's 12 is recall those R's during your everyday work. Because that's what a circular economy is, means it needs to be integrated everywhere and at any time alongside the previous R's. And with that, I would like to give back the floor to the chair as we go, and you will see in the subsequent sessions throughout today and tomorrow and on Friday during the various presentations of all the different actors and all the stakeholders that are working with us on sustainable resource management, which includes, of course, circularity alongside many other principles and many other issues, how you are actually implementing them in real life. And we will have many examples tomorrow, particularly tomorrow afternoon session around that. And so I'll invite the audience to stick around and see how what we heard today is actually happening already, taking place, and how can more particularly scale it up, as that is what is necessary right now. Thank you, Chair, and back to you.
Thank you for all the discussion. Thank you very much for our colleagues online, for the panelists, and see you next time. Thank you.